Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back. I hope that you are all well, keeping warm. So let's just finish off the last few slides for our, that initial slide set, and then we'll move on to discussion about actual crime scene and how a crime scene is approached by criminalists. So increasingly throughout the country, indeed throughout the world, jurisdictions are organizing crime evidence collection and examination and maintenance, administration really, into dedicated crime labs. Those, depending on the size of the jurisdiction, those crime labs may have various experts associated with them. And perhaps one of the most important features of the crime lab is that personnel of the crime lab are responsible for maintenance of evidence and for all maintaining what we're going to learn in a little while is incredibly important, a chain of custody. That is, that evidence, once it is collected, is documented from its origin until the point at which it is presented in court. And all the way along that in those processes, there has to be documentation of exactly who had custody of evidence under what conditions, so that evidence never disappears for a time into an unknown space where it could be tampered with or altered in any way. We know the entire history of a piece of evidence from the crime scene right up until it's presented in court. Now, that evidence is then examined by various experts, depending on what it is. The crime lab may have those experts in-house to do that examination, or they may be responsible for the administration of taking that evidence and transporting it to an expert for examination. Again, always keeping track who has the evidence under what conditions. So the growth of crime labs was actually driven by the growth of science of criminalistics and increasing gathering of evidence and its processing meant that this placed a tremendous burden, for example, on ordinary police precincts if they were trying to do both crime solving and apprehending of criminals, etc., etc. Instead, crime scene evidence began to be hived off to dedicated crime labs. The oldest crime lab in the country was in Los Angeles, founded in 1923. But there is a major problem with crime labs, indeed with criminal investigation all over the United States, and that is that it is extremely fragmented. It can be fragmented down to the level of the county or individual police precincts, each of them with a certain amount of independence from everybody else. That means that it becomes very, very difficult to coordinate between different precincts. You might, for example, have a criminal operating in several different precincts, and each precinct actually examining only the crimes which took place in their precinct, not realizing that there is additional evidence outside in other precincts. It's a very big problem, this fragmentation. And this becomes especially important when crimes are committed, for example, between states. For this reason, the first federal crime lab was established by J. Edgar Hoover in 1932. And that is the Federal Bureau of Investigations. But there are strict limits on the types of crime which the FBI can investigate. They do not normally get involved with local crimes unless it fits into certain parameters where the FBI is permitted by legislation to become involved. And there is a great apprehension in the United States about establishing a nationwide policing. and instead precincts, counties, municipalities, etc., tend to want to guard their independence and may each have their own crime labs in actual fact. There are 411 public crime labs, and those operate at all different levels. There are some municipal, county, state, and then the federal crime labs as well. Sorry. So this increase in crime labs, as I say, is partly due to the growth of the science of criminalistics, but also there are certain aspects of crime in the United States which are on the increase. The first was a huge boom in drug offenses, partly due to reform of legislation, which made punishment of drug offenses much more stringent. But also because there just was an increase in popularity of drug use in the United States. Remembering, it's difficult to remember this now, but even marijuana was regarded as being a serious drug offense. Possession of marijuana was a serious drug offense, which would require its own investigation each time it occurred. And crime labs actually from the 1970s, 1980s especially became inundated with specimens linked to drug cases. In addition, there has been a tremendous acceleration in the ownership of guns. And along with that, relaxed legislation around the owning and carrying of guns and ammunition. And unfortunately, there's a direct correlation between rates of gun ownership and violence associated with guns. Not only crime, but suicide as well, which suicide would have to be carefully investigated as any other likely crime, and would still be the responsibility of members of a crime lab. And all of those, gun crime has been increasing, commensurate with increases in gun ownership. The last thing that has led to the absolute requirement that we have crime labs is the development of DNA profiling, the use of DNA as an identification mechanism. We'll talk much more about that later on. We have several classes devoted to DNA and to its use in crime investigation. But I would just tell you that DNA profiling is not an easy matter. And it requires very, very careful laboratory conditions. It needs to be really carefully done. And as a result, the whole sections of crime labs have become dedicated simply to dealing with DNA and with it and its sequencing and identification. So for a crime lab, there may be all sorts of technical arms to investigations being done in a crime lab. And the usual in a crime lab, there are 5 different branches. There may be others, but usually these are the sort of things which a crime lab would seek to have under its roof. First of all, a physical science unit, which would actually identify, compare physical evidence. And that would include such things as people who can analyze, do chemical analysis, look at soils, geology, people with skills in geology who look at soils and that sort of thing. The biology unit, this is what encompasses all of the studies such as blood, looking at blood samples, body fluids, that would include DNA, etc., hair, fiber samples, this sort of thing. A firearms unit, this is almost invariable that precincts will have their own firearms unit, and they will look at trying to identify firearms, and they look at discharged bullets, cartridge cases, shells, ammunition, structure of guns, etc., etc. And in addition, would also be responsible for tracing firearms through the bureaucracy of licensing and everything else. Document units. Now, this is not every crime lab is going to have a document unit, but they certainly may do. If a crime unit lacks any of these arms of expertise, they will have contact somewhere where they can send material out to be examined. Document unit, document units will examine documents, examine things like signatures, handwriting, and various other aspects of identifying a document and who was responsible for producing the document. Invariable in crime scene investigation is the last one, and that is the photographic unit. And photographic evidence is tremendously, tremendously important, because at a crime scene, you can look at virtually everything at a crime scene as being ephemeral. It's not there in perpetuity. A shell casing lying on the floor, the place where that shell casing is lying may itself provide information, but somebody is going to pick up that shell casing and take it to a crime lab for further investigation. They're going to move it from the place where it's sitting on the floor or wherever. A photograph of that shell casing, which locates it in that physical space of the crime scene, may be tremendously important, and the photographer is an essential part of any crime scene investigation. And there are also now increasingly use of video, but also computer imaging. This is becoming a major field of endeavor for any photographic unit. There are many crime labs will also have toxicology units, largely because of the number of crimes which are associated with drugs and with alcohol. And then very, very importantly, they may have, although this may be tackled by the biology unit or whatever, they may have a dedicated latent fingerprint unit, which specializes in processing and examining evidence of fingerprints. Okay, so what are I keep on referring to the fact that all of this is a science, that we use scientific method in forensics and in criminalistics. And this is not just hand waving. In actual fact, the scientific method is a thing. It is a recognized set of principles, which are, when applied, designate something as having been examined scientifically. And this is the way it's done. First of all, observation is made. Observation is not in itself a conclusion, nor is it an argument, but it may lead you to ask a question. And that is the first critical phase of scientific examination: formulation of a question to ask, and then to propose an hypothesis, a logical, possible answer to the question. And science doesn't leave it there. It doesn't accept the hypothesis as the answer. Instead, science tests the hypothesis. And it will test the hypothesis either through experimentation or through further rigorous observation under very carefully controlled circumstances. After that is done, the hypothesis is either accepted or rejected. If it's accepted, if the hypothesis is accepted, it becomes suitable as scientific evidence. We'll take a simple example. You pick up a flashlight and you try to switch the flashlight on, and the light doesn't go on. Okay, this is an observation. There's no light when I try to switch. So Formulate just ask why is this light not working? Formulate an hypothesis. Let's hypothesize that the batteries have run down. Right, so there's our hypothesis. The batteries are flat. Unscrew the flashlight, throw them away, put 2 brand new ones in, close it up, press the switch. What are you doing when you press the switch? You're testing your hypothesis. I'm testing my hypothesis. I've replaced the batteries. That's my experiment. Now I'm going to test. Doesn't work. The light doesn't come on. Do you accept your hypothesis? What was your hypothesis? Your hypothesis was the batteries were flat. You've put new batteries in, they don't work. You have to reject that hypothesis. That is not the answer, right? Instead, what's another hypothesis? You move to another hypothesis. This is what scientists do the whole time. They reject an hypothesis and they move to another one. What's our next hypothesis for our flashlight? The bulb is gone. The bulb is burned out. Okay, unscrew the hole, unscrew the bulb, put a new bulb in, switch it on. Now the flashlight goes on. What was our second hypothesis? The flashlight was gone. What did we do? We replaced the flashlight. That was an experiment that we performed. Switch it on to see what the result of our experiment is. Bingo, the light goes on. We accept our hypothesis. We could now, if were we called on to do so, we could go to a court of law and say, Your Honor, the flashlight didn't work because the bulb was gone. The bulb had blown. We proved it by scientific experimentation. It's a simple example, but it applies through many, it applies over and over and over again. It becomes, in fact, almost second nature. But what is not happening? What is not happening is that somebody is picking up the flashlight, waving it around and saying ghosts made it go dead. A ghost stopped it from working. Why is that not science? Well, first of all, it's patently nonsense, but quite apart from that, you can't test the hypothesis. It's impossible to test whether ghosts made the flashlight go dead, okay? Nor is it just opinion. Nor do you stand there with the flashlight and say, you know, I think maybe this flashlight never worked, and put it aside. It's useless. You haven't proceeded. You haven't moved forward at all by doing that. Now, the next, I have to apologize. The next part of this slide, I used to show this movie In the Bag in class. It's a true crime thing. And then I would ask them these questions. So and unfortunately, that link has gone dead, and I can't find it, and I can't include it anymore. I'll just tell you, it's a good example of how a criminalist might actually use the scientific method to further investigation. This is a crime which the place, the crime scene was investigated, and there was very obviously evidence missing. They had suspects, and the evidence was not at their place of abode, nor was it at the crime scene. And they knew that things were missing. There was clothing missing, and weapons and this sort of thing were all gone. And one of the investigators realized that in driving to the crime scene from outside, you had to pass over several rivers. There's an observation. So they said, okay, maybe it's just a hypothesis. It's a good educated guess. Maybe the perpetrator threw the evidence off a bridge into a river. Right, there's a good hypothesis. Now they go to each of the bridges. Each bridge they examine, has their stuff been thrown off the bridge? Is there stuff in the river? Each of those is an experiment. It's a scientific experiment. Most of them, there was nothing. The hypothesis was rejected for that particular bridge. But eventually, they found one bridge where indeed the perpetrator had thrown stuff off the bridge, and there it was. There, the hypothesis was accepted. So that's a good example of how the scientific method can lead us through different steps in an investigation. Okay, so what are the skills of a forensic scientist in general? Well, first of all, the forensic scientist must be skilled in whatever they're doing, physical or natural science. They must be skilled in their techniques, but they must be able to acquire evidence in a scientific manner. They must be able to acquire that evidence and process it in a scientific manner. And for a criminalist, somebody specialized in gathering of evidence may be called on to collect evidence in areas which are well outside their expertise to actually examine. So they have to be generally well aware of what may or may not constitute evidence at a crime scene, so that can be collected and then sent to the appropriate experts. A forensic scientist must be able to process evidence in a scientific manner and be able to present that as expert court testimony. And the forensic scientist can be sure that they are going to be examined very closely by in cross-examination by defense attorneys, for example. So they must have all their ducks in a row. That evidence must be carefully collected. It must be incontrovertible. It must be untainted, and it must be carefully analyzed. An expert witness is an individual who has special expertise, something often which lies outside the scope of an ordinary crime lab, and certainly outside the scope of a criminalist, of a regular criminalist to investigate. And so an expert witness, it will be called on to evaluate evidence which is based on very, very specialized training. So for example, a criminalist at a crime scene may collect body fluids. They will be very careful to collect those body fluids in a way which preserves any evidentiary possibility, any evidentiary character. They then will pass those body fluids on, let's say, to somebody who is able to extract DNA, sequence it, and analyze it, and present a statistical case to the court. The chances that somebody else left this body fluid other than the perpetrator is 1 in 3 billion. That is the realm of an expert. And it is up to the expert to express an opinion as to the significance, that is the statistical significance of their findings, whatever it is, whether it's blood, fingerprinting, or whatever. So this is, in the early days of the 20th century, led to something of a problem, because in the 1910s, 1920s, the actual imposition of science into criminal investigation was relatively new. Up until then, very often what the courts accepted as evidence was largely opinion, not science-based evidence, but evidence based on somebody's opinion, on a detective's opinion, on the opinion of witnesses, on the evidence of witnesses. Very often that was the major source of evidence, which is can be very, very unreliable. In 1923, in a specific case settled by the Supreme Court, Fry versus the United States, the court made a decision that scientific expertise, scientific evidence presented in a court had to be presented in this evidence had to be generally acceptable to the scientific community. In other words, it had to be respectable science. So, for example, you could not have somebody coming into the court who said that they were a scientist who studied phrenology. Okay, that's somebody who studies the lumps on your head and determines your character by the shape of your skull. This was a thing. Okay, there were phrenologists all over the place who would read your head and say, tell you all sorts of things about yourself from the lumps on your head. So before Fry, the prosecution could have called a phrenologist in who'd come in and say, yes, well, I felt the lumps on this guy's man's head, and he has the head of a criminal and a murderer, and so it was probably him. Fry versus the United States set a standard. It said, scientific evidence which is presented in the courtroom has to be generally acceptable science. It has to be accepted by the scientific community in general. That was very, very important because it eliminated a lot of opinion from the courtroom and instead made evidence, straightened evidence to science. But there's a problem. There's a problem with the Fry standard, and that is science is rapidly developing. And very often, a scientist, a pioneering scientist, is not generally, his work is not generally accepted. They may be far out ahead of their field. And at the time, the work is not generally accepted by the scientific community, despite the fact that it's valid. So much later on, in 1993, there was a case, Dorbert versus Merrell-Dow Pharmaceuticals. And in this case, the Supreme Court asserted that the Fry standard, while it's a good standard in that evidence must be acceptable, scientifically acceptable, it's not an absolute prerequisite to admissibility of scientific evidence. And that if you could present a good case that this was good science, even though it wasn't generally accepted currently generally accepted by the scientific community, then a trial judge could accept it. An example for you is that the very first DNA case solved by DNA, when that was presented in court, that was entirely new. There was no other case, there was no case history which would say that this was generally accepted in the scientific community, but the prosecution could come in and say, this is based on very good science. Here is science, here is the scientific backing, which is generally acceptable, even though this technique is new and has not yet been accepted. And Dorbert versus Merrell-Dow, that allows that it was very, very important, especially given the very rapid advances that are being made in scientific investigation. Okay, so go to your textbook and read up this case. It's a short case study. This is Dr. Coppolino's Deadly House Calls. It sounds like a fiction novel, but it's not. It's actually a true case. And this is to illustrate for you the tremendous importance of Dorbert, because the evidence presented in this case, toxicology and everything, would not have been admitted in court had the defense been able to press for a very strict interpretation of the Fry standard. And instead, the Dorbert standard allowed this evidence into the court because it was good science, even though it was new. So Dorbert said, the trial judge accepted that it was. It was still appealed, I believe, but it failed on it. The appeal failed. The court said, no, this is good evidence, and the science is sound. Okay, so this just is a further discussion of Dorbit. And Dorbit is really important because it didn't just liberate people to come into the courtroom and say anything that they liked. They come into the courtroom and say, I am a scientist and I think this. Instead, it said expert testimony can be accepted, but it has to be based in solid scientific principle. And very often what will happen in a case like this is one acceptance, like the DNA case, for example. Once it had been accepted in a court of law, it spurs the use of those methods much more widely in further cases. So novel investigation methods in science and in forensic science are tremendously important because that is what moves the field forward, even though often initially they might not be widely accepted. Okay, there are some branches of forensic science which are highly specialized, but which you do very often hear about. These would not necessarily be part of a crime lab, but these are all branches of forensic science which prosecution and defense might resort to in examining a crime. And these are things like forensic psychiatry, forensic psychology as well, but forensic psychiatry in particular, where human behavior is examined. And this you will very often hear. You will hear forensic psychiatrists testifying for both prosecution and for defense. Forensic odontology. Forensic odontology is the study of teeth. Now, this is really important because your teeth are amongst the hardest and most durable part of your skeleton. And there are two things about that. First of all, teeth very often survive when almost nothing else survives, even when the rest of the skeleton is lost. For example, if a body is burned, or if it is buried under special circumstances, like in acid soils, whatever, very often the teeth will survive, and the teeth can be used for identification. That is the role of forensic odontology. But in addition, in the commission of violent crime, very often the perpetrator will actually bite the victim, either deliberately or inadvertently. For instance, if a victim slams their fist or their hand into the mouth of a perpetrator, there may be a bite mark left behind. And it is the responsibility of the forensic odontologist to examine that as well. And we'll have more to say about that because it's a very contentious field. So that's forensic odontology. Forensic engineering, this is a field which examines things like building bridge failure, which forensic engineering attempts to reconstruct accidents, and may also come in to examine cause, origin of fires and of explosions. So forensic engineering is a really important field, but a highly specialized one. Most crime labs would have to have reference and pull in a forensic engineer as a consultant. Forensic computer science. Now, this is something, it used to be quite rare, and there were only a few forensic computer scientists. Now it's becoming increasingly common because of the real importance, for example, of social media. And combined with this, I would say, is forensic cell phone analysis and cell phone tracking. These increasingly, each of us have a little tracking device in our pocket, which is making a record of our progress around the country continuously, as long as we have it switched on. These are all becoming extremely important in many excrimes. So forensic computer science, extracting information from computers, then extracting information from cells and cell phones rather, and especially tracking where cell phones have been as a way of tracking their owner. Lots of crime labs, this is something that you should think about, that many crime labs now have dedicated evidence technicians, and they are trained to actually collect evidence. That is their sole purpose. They have nothing to do with evidence analysis or anything like that, but they are trained to go to a crime scene, look at it, carefully examine it, and determine what is likely to be evidence and what is not. This may no longer be true. Your text says that there's currently no formal training, but I believe that there are now training, that there is training available. But many crime labs will employ technicians, evidence technicians, and train them themselves in a kind of an apprentice sort of system. That may be something some of you might be interested in. Okay, so let's move on to discussing how a crime scene is actually approached. Given that a crime has taken place, that crime scene is a repository. Remember Locard's principle for a start. Every criminal leaves something behind and takes something away. It is up to those examining a crime scene to see what it is that the criminal has left behind and what they have determine what is it that they've taken away that might link them to the crime scene. It is up to those examining the crime scene to determine what constitutes evidence, what can tell a story about the crime that has taken place. At the same time, it is up to those examining the crime scene, responding to a crime and responding to the crime scene, to disturb the crime scene as little as possible. Locard also says that every one of us going into the crime scene is going to alter that crime scene. It's up to those doing the investigation, etc., to see to it that they alter the crime scene as little as possible, and where it is unavoidable that they alter the crime scene, that a careful record is kept of what the crime scene was like beforehand. Think of it this way: you go to a murder, the body ultimately has to be moved. The body has to be picked up and moved. That is altering the crime scene. But before the body is moved, the very position of the body, etc., it may be very important. That is where all of that, the special techniques for photography, videography, etc., all come into play, so that a record can be kept of the crime scene before it is deliberately altered. So when a crime is committed, somebody arrives at the crime scene. There is some realization, one way or the other, that a crime has taken place. And usually the first official arriving at the crime scene will be a member of law enforcement. The very first person, official to arrive, their immediate responsibility is to those who are alive, and acquiring medical assistance for an injured victim, even if and assisting those who have been wounded or whatever, even at the risk of altering the crime scene. That is a primary responsibility. As far as possible, medical personnel will avoid disturbing the crime scene, avoid disturbing evidence as much as possible. And law enforcement may go so far as to provide an alternative route into the crime scene or to a victim, so that a direct route which a perpetrator might have used is not altered in any way. However, the primary responsibility is saving life. And so everything else is secondary to that. And if need be, then the medical personnel are not committing a crime by altering the crime scene in their efforts to save a life. The second responsibility of law enforcement is to determine whether there are any potential suspects or witnesses and make sure that there's probably not necessarily cause to arrest them, but make sure that contact can be maintained with them, and that as immediately as possible, as soon as possible, statements are taken from potential suspects and potential witnesses at the scene. If complete statements cannot be taken there and then, which is often the case, you often only get a preliminary statement, then lines of communication must be established. The law enforcement must know where those people are going to be, where they live, and what their contact is. Next, law enforcement secures the crime scene. They evict from the crime scene everybody who is not law enforcement, who is not going to be able to gather evidence, etc. A boundary is established around the crime scene. Usually, the boundary around a crime scene, obviously, a judgment has to be made where the boundary lies, but at least the initial boundary is usually wide, and they try to encompass any area where evidence might occur. Of course, they haven't examined the crime scene carefully yet, so it is a judgment call, but they will establish a boundary within which it is reasonable to suspect that all really important evidence lies. And then the boundary is sealed off, and people are kept out. They're kept out for low cards principle. Everybody coming in is runs the risk of bringing stuff in and taking stuff away. So the crime scene has to be maintained as close to original as possible, and if need be, guards are posted. Many police precincts employ a security firm. They don't waste the time of law enforcement to secure a crime scene. They actually employ security firms. There are security firms which specialize in crime scene maintenance. It is up to the responding officer or the senior responding officer ultimately to determine what personnel need to come into the crime scene. And that may include calling coroner, it may include calling evidence technicians, fingerprint technicians, photographer, etc., etc. The precinct will designate lead law enforcement officers who will go to the crime scene as soon as possible and take charge. And then thereafter they are in charge of determining who comes in and who examines what. It is also up to them eventually to determine when all possible evidence has been obtained from a crime scene. It is up to them to decide, okay, the crime scene now it's yielded up everything that's going to yield up, it can be now reopened. You need to remember that crime scene very often is actually where, for example, it's where somebody lives. It may be where a family lives, and they are excluded from that place as long as it is a crime scene, a designated crime scene. So, out of a sense of compassion, very often law enforcement will process a crime scene as quickly as possible, so that people can get back to using it. So this is familiar to you. Of course, you may even have seen it yourself, but you've certainly seen it on crime scene movies, etc. Is the yellow crime scene tape, which designates the boundary of the crime scene. Immediately, the law enforcement officer arrives at the crime scene, he or she may begin marking particularly significant pieces of evidence that are immediately obvious. A bullet casing, for example, they may place a marker immediately next to a bullet casing. It marks it, the position absolutely. When it's photographed, that marker is there. It also ensures that nobody kicks that bullet casing away or steps on it or anything. They will examine a crime scene and try and determine what are likely entrance and exit routes that a perpetrator may have used, because a lot of evidence may be gathered on that pathway. They keep a detailed log of everybody who goes in and out, and begin keeping a very detailed evidence log where exactly things were and what they have designated as being evidence. Fairly obviously, anybody coming into the crime scene has to behave with incredible discipline, because they cannot, for example, do things like come in eating something, dropping food, etc. Besides which, if they're busy eating, they're certainly not paying much attention to what's going on around them. They're smoking, eating, drinking. People in the crimes have to be incredibly careful not to inadvertently litter, not to, for example, you can reach into your pocket to get a pen or something, pull it out and drop a Kleenex on which you've blown your nose. Well, that now lies on the floor, and somebody else, an evidence technician, comes along, sees that lying there, doesn't know it came out of your pocket, thinks it's a piece of evidence. And that can set off a whole train of events, which could be very difficult to sort out. The search for evidence has to be thorough, and it has to be absolutely systematic. Those who gather the evidence have to be sure that they have examined every possible avenue where evidence might be. And that is often done, especially if the crime scene is outside, for example. They will establish a search pattern, a way of searching systematically through the crime scene. Law enforcement officers, often on arrival at a crime scene, will do a walkthrough. They will do an initial survey, avoiding any pathways which the perpetrator might have used. Sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes you simply have to, but you do it in such a way that you don't disturb anything on the pathway. As far as possible, they use indirect routes to enter and exit the crime scene. Immediately begin marking obvious pieces of evidence, as I've said, bullet casings, blood spatter, anything of that sort. And in addition, they have to always look at a crime scene with an eye saying, what looks out of place here? What doesn't look right? This doesn't sound very scientific, but it is, because what the crime scene investigator is doing is they are making careful observation. They can then test those observations, right? But often very, very important evidence is gathered because of experience. An investigator has a lot of experience of looking at a crime scene, and they enter a crime scene and something just doesn't look right. Something doesn't fit. Something looks out of place. Very often, that is a clue to them that this could be evidentiary. Okay, especially outside, crime scene outside, evidence may be very difficult to see. Inside may be somewhat easier. For example, if blood spatter is more obvious in a room, on a wall, etc., a bullet casing is easy to see lying on a carpet. Outside, blood spatter, bullet casings, all sorts of evidence can be obscured by vegetation, by the soil itself, etc. And the crime scene has to be very, very carefully examined. And in order to do so, they will use a search pattern. Whoever is in charge, the officers in charge, will utilize personnel to walk through the crime scene in a set pattern to ensure that every square inch of the crime scene is closely eyed for potential evidence. I'm not going to run. These are fairly obvious. That all of these are ways in which a set area might be examined, either by walking a grid, by walking through in a looping manner like this. If this is often done, the spiral search is done if you've only got one person doing the search, for example. This is a way for a single person to be able to know that they've moved through a whole area and examined. When you use multiple personnel, usually you limit the width of observation. This person moving through here is not looking over there and over there for evidence. They're looking for evidence here and here. They're looking for evidence in a band. They've already examined this part here. Now they're coming back and they're examining a band that they did not look at before. And the people next to them, their observation area will overlap slightly, so that you can be sure by the time the whole area and every square inch has been examined. I have to say that even doing this, evidence can still remain, only to be found later. If, a very small blood spot might be missed or something like this. So this doesn't close off the possibility of further examination later on. The issue of looking for what is present and what looks out of place and what might be pertinent, these are all judgment calls. It is relatively easy. If you see something large, like a hammer, a knife, something like this lying in a crime scene, to be able to say, okay, that is likely to be evidence. Photograph it, mark it, photograph it, bag it and take it as evidence, that is relatively easy to do. But important evidence may actually be almost microscopic. And this is goes to the importance of actually searching those areas very, very carefully. And these are things which evidence technicians are especially trained to do. And that is to look for very small things, paint chips, very small blood spots, hairs, which often which look unusual, which don't match their surroundings, unusual soil. Perpetrators often will track in soil from another area on their shoes, glass fragments. All of these things may be significant, and we'll hear during this semester, we'll hear about how some of them have been used in specific cases. Okay, recording is incredibly important, and many, many cases have failed, prosecutions have failed in court because defense have been able to show that proper recording was not kept of evidence gathered at a scene. And for this reason, photography and sketches and notes, careful handwritten notes, are the three methods which since the beginning of the 20th century have served as the backbone of most investigations. Ideally, all three are used, but in a small precinct, in a very small, say in a rural precinct somewhere, remote, it might not be possible to have a professional police photography. For example, you might have somebody taking photographs who is not a trained evidence photographer. But as far as possible, these kinds of records do need to be kept. It's the importance of sketches is, as opposed to photography, is a little bit difficult to explain. But sketches are very important. When you look at a photograph, almost everything in the photograph has equal image value. And so a photograph can actually be quite confusing. A sketch can pull out what seems to be really important to the person who is sketching. A sketch can blur out, for example, if you want to think of it that way, stuff which is not relevant to what the sketcher is looking at. And sketches can be very, very illuminating and can carry a lot of weight in examining the crime and in presentation of evidence in a court of law. There are some circumstances, for example, where photography is very, very difficult, and there sketching would be your only way of producing evidence. Note-taking is something which is also really important, and unfortunately, again, this sometimes is neglected by law enforcement personnel, and it can lead to tremendous difficulties in a court of law with an assiduous defense attorney can start to pick apart a law enforcement officer's investigation because they did not have good notes about where, when, and why. So we should have a complete written record of the history of the crime, who contacted the investigator, when did investigators arrive at the crime scene, what was the initial evidence, the initial information rather, that was presented to law enforcement. A log is kept, who arrives at the crime scene. Even in modern times, the failure to do this can result in absolute chaos. An example is the O.J. Simpson case, where numerous people came in and out of a crime scene and the imperfect records were kept of who came in and who went out. There were footprints all over the place that they didn't know who they belonged to. That's an example of what happens when control of a crime scene starts to get lost. It ends up in a chaotic situation. Even at initial entry to a crime scene, law enforcement may begin producing a preliminary structure to the case, a likely scenario. That can be tossed out for further investigation. That's not necessarily going to be what is going to be presented in a court of law, but it forms a structure to work with. In other words, initial hypotheses may be drawn up. These notes can become voluminous, and often investigators will go back and we'll type them up in a computer format, but the handwritten notes are evidence and are kept. They are kept as a record. They are written into a notebook whose pages cannot be torn out, and that is a specific requirement. Usually, depending on the precinct, very often they will have a specific format that they will require that law enforcement personnel use in order to make notes. And notes are not made in pencil, despite what you've seen in detective movies. They are made with indelible pen. which cannot be erased. There is a little video for you about photographing of crime scene. And again, here's a possible career for some of you if you're interested and good at photography. And you're interested in forensic science, well, there is one very, very important area of criminalistics which you could become involved in. So I'm going to stop there for today, and then I'll see you on Wednesday. And don't forget, please, Wednesday is a live class. You are not obliged to log into the live class. I understand that I have people who are busy working. I have people in other countries with totally different time zones, etc., etc. I'm not keeping a record of who comes into the live class, but it is an opportunity for you to at least get some feeling that you're in a class with other people, and obviously for you to be able to ask questions of me as well. Okay, and I'll see you then on Wednesday.